The Korean government made an announcement about a problem a long time ago. A while back, Japan took control of Korea and made Korean people work for them. Some people were treated very badly during that time, so the Korean government wanted to say sorry by giving them money. But instead of Japan paying the money, Korean companies will pay it. This has made some people very upset because they think it's not fair. Today, we will learn more about this agreement between Korea and Japan. Victims of Japanese occupation. From 1910 to 1945, Japan took control of Korea and made it a part of Japan. During this period, Korea lost its independence, and many Koreans were treated unfairly and exploited by Japan. The most common examples of exploitation included forced labor, where people were made to work against their will, forced conscription, where people were forced to fight in wars, and comfort women, who were forced to serve as sex slaves for Japanese soldiers. Recently, victims of forced labor spoke out about their experiences, as they were taken to other countries and subjected to intense work without proper working conditions and payment. They are now raising the issue in the latest agreement, demanding compensation for their suffering. Treaty on Basic Relations between Japan and the Republic of Korea. After Korea was liberated in 1945, the compensation for the victims of Japanese occupation became a topic of discussion. There were several discussions held, but they were unsuccessful every time since the Japanese government didn't properly apologize and make compensations. Then, in the 1960s, Park Chung-hee's government signed the Treaty on Basic Relations between Japan and the Republic of Korea, a treaty designed to normalize diplomatic relations between South Korea and Japan and compensate Japanese occupation victims. In the treaty, the two countries agreed that Japan would provide over $300 million in funds and that Korea wouldn't take issue with compensation for the victims any longer. However, it did not include any specific compensation or apology for the victims. It meant that South Korea could no longer demand an apology or compensation from Japan, which resulted in controversy. Negotiation and agreement on comfort women issue between the Republic of Korea and Japan. In 2015, the Korean government reached an agreement with Japan regarding compensation for the victims of comfort women in the Japanese military. Under the agreement, the Prime Minister of Japan formally apologized and acknowledged the Japanese government's responsibility for the comfort women issue. It was also agreed that South Korea and Japan would establish a joint fund to compensate the victims of the comfort women. At this time, both governments declared that the Japanese military comfort women issue was finally closed. But many people reacted negatively to it and said that it was a rushed deal that ignored the opinions of the relevant parties. Settlement on compensation payment by Korean companies for forced labor. The compensation issue for victims of the Japanese occupation has not been resolved, so the victims of forced labor filed a lawsuit in Korean courts. The Supreme Court decided that Japanese companies responsible for war crimes should compensate the victims directly, but the Japanese companies didn't agree. Instead, the current government reached an agreement with Japan where Korean companies would pay compensation for the forced labor instead. Some people who disagree with the settlement argue that the Japanese companies who committed the crimes should be responsible for payment, and without this, victims won't receive a sincere apology or remorse. On the other hand, those who support the settlement believe that the best solution is for companies that receive compensation from Japan to pay the victims. They also think that this agreement will strengthen the relationship between South Korea, Japan, and the United States.